Welcome to the Ultimate 83 GTI project. I'm going to review the original goals for the project and the results and get into all the details of putting the car together and how it turned out. The main purpose of this is to inform a prospective buyer of the car. At the end of this, I've got an actual video reviewing the car, exterior and interior, just going over it in fine detail with the video camera for someone that would be doing a walk around inspection of the vehicle. So the original goal was to really, throw cost issues aside and say, what would it take to build, the very best GTI possible. And there's a bias there because I was an original Mark I owner back in 1983, but I really have always felt that simplicity and old school mechanical connection between the driver and the road is a key part of bringing a driving experience together. Any proper race car is very mechanical, very direct between the hands and the feet of the driver and your butt and what's going on in the tire patch and the track. And modern cars really do an amazing job of providing creature comforts and even massive amounts of performance, but it does come often at the cost of removing you from the driving experience. So I've always felt that the going back to simplicity, and the Mark I had a fantastic reputation when it was introduced in October of '82 in the American market for being a very cost-effective, high-performance car, really putting more expensive cars to shame. So anyway, there were two variants of that most GTI enthusiasts got excited about. One was the Callaway Stage 2 Turbo, which netted out to almost 180 horsepower, and the very rare Oettinger 16S, which was produced independently but was actually eventually partnered with the factory, the VW factory, and they produced that car in France for the French and the Swiss markets, producing 5,000 of them in total in 1981 and 82. And that's the one that I really read up on and got very excited about. And so, that's where I wanted to go, was keeping it light, keeping it simple, and normally aspirated. So stole the Mark II 16-valve 9A cylinder heads and based the whole concept around that. What I ended up with was a car that I think looks like it rolled off the factory floor. 1983, totally stock exterior look, totally stock interior look, true wolf in sheep's clothing approach. And as long as you're not going off of a standing start, you're going to be faster than a lot of other modern cars, including the Golf R. Where the Golf R and other all-wheel drive vehicles have an advantage is that they have more traction off the line. So you just stand on the throttle and go. Whereas with this Mark I car and its power-to-weight ratio, 240 horsepower and under 2,000 pounds, it's still capable of 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds. But with a set of slicks and even with all-wheel drive, it'd probably be 3 seconds. Anyway, amazing little car. I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the performance results here, and then we'll get into the details of the project. So I hired Case Nirop. He had worked for many years as a Porsche factory race driver, ran for Porsche at Le Mans, 24 hours of Le Mans, won Sebring, 12 hours of Sebring for them and a number of other races. He's of Dutch descent, retired and living in actual Canada, in the west side of Canada. So got him down from Kelowna to the Victoria Airport, and then drove him up to the Vancouver Island Motorsport Circuit. And he's had opportunity to drive several cars around that track. Certainly knows how to drive them all to their fullest capability. So we were running a 1 minute 25 second lap times with the Ultimate 83 GTI, and he was in a little bit slower than that in a 917 Cayman S Porsche. So that was a high watermark to say this thing brakes like crazy, accelerates like crazy, and corners like crazy, and predictable, enjoyable car. So there's a separate video you can look up on YouTube on Case driving the car and his comments, and we interviewed him afterwards. So, I had an original Mark 1, as I had said before, and just sort of lessons learned. You want to keep the weight off the front of these cars. They're front-wheel drive, the engine's up there, the transmission's up there. So heavy front weight rise, 2/3 front, basically. And so you just don't want to add power by stuffing a big engine with a lot of weight. And a lot of times putting in a more modern engine, you have to put in a more modern transmission, and the combination is going to add 100 plus pounds to the front end. And I really wanted to avoid that. I had auto-slalomed my original car and run it a little bit on circuit tracks, race tracks, and so I knew what was involved. The key thing actually was the unibody. Very weak unibody, flexes a ton. You'll see anybody that had a Mark 1 car was putting, stress bars in and, stiffening components, bolt-ons. In my case, because this was a complete down to the bare metal restoration, I was able to weld a ton of metal in, and we'll get into that. But that makes a huge difference, having like very solid reference points for the suspension and everything to work on, and it just makes the car feel so much better. Obviously, anybody that tells you that they've got a rust-free Mark 1 car may not know the truth, because unless you get under the car and remove the latex-based undercoating, you won't see the rust. It typically develops in the pinch weld areas, and it's a huge amount of work to strip these cars down to the bare metal, inside and out. For me, it took over 500 hours, and you could have sped that up if I just walnut shelled it and paid someone several $1,000s to do it, but I incrementally kind of hacked away at it and eventually got it done. And then, you find rust where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. So, the idea about building a car that has got balance to it, balance as in like it has enough power and rigidity, but it can brake and corner, everything in sort of equal measure. That's where I consider to be happiness. And I've done a lot of cars over the years, so I can say that with some level of authority. With the GTI, you got to be really careful. There's not a lot of suspension travel in the front of the car. Can't lower it too much. And it looks, from my perspective, a little weird. People really slam the Mark 1s, and that's their thing. But for me, keeping a 3/4 inch gap between the top of the tire and the fender lip is what I think is proper, and still looks semi-stock. And I don't like super loud exhaust. I think it gets tiring and makes the car just sort of, for me, it sort of cheapens it a bit. So like to have power without a lot of noise. And wanted to keep as much of the original car as possible to keep that sense of the fun factor that everyone raved about back in the day. Here's actually a picture of me driving my original GTI back in 1984 on Highway 1 north of San Francisco, and that's classic for me to search out great roads to drive on. So in terms of I really wanted to be 1,800 pounds track ready, and certainly under 2,000 pounds on the street. 1950 was my target. And I wanted to be around that 7 pounds per horsepower, which is sort of a modern supercar power to weight ratio. And wanted to keep everything as close as possible to stock looking. So that meant OEM, the original Snowflakes wheels, and that limited me to smaller rotor diameters, like 10.1 inch. But with the right brake pads and the right 4-piston calipers, I was able to get world-class braking, something that the original car didn't have. So nice to have this car putting almost 1.5 Gs of braking on the racetrack. So the specs, it's crazy to put thousands of hours and $140,000 into the car, but I got obsessed about this, my OCD behavior, and so where it sits today, because I'm selling it, is it's got a brand new windshield. Most of the car has been repainted, bumpers and fender flares and everything, so the paint is awesome. 600 miles since I put the KW V3 coilovers on, and those are like high dollar, full adjustable suspension, so that's basically brand new. The engine is just broken in. Rebuilt it in the spring. It's had really just 2 trips. So even though there's quite a few miles, 4,000 miles, it happened literally in 2 trips. And no high RPM use, no racing, no nitrous use. The engine's basically just broken in now. And yeah, so it's with the independent throttle bodies, the car produces quite a bit of power from 7,000 RPM up to 8,000, depending on whether it has the catalytic converter installed and the air box and air filter. If you go track ready and you pull off the cat and you put the vibrant resonator in the exhaust, it's a bit louder and produces more power, obviously. But it's remarkable the amount of torque this car produces. It actually has more torque at all RPMs than the stock car ever had, and it's almost flat from 3,000 RPM on up. It's beautiful torque curve on the car. So even though it's got racing cams and it's got the independent throttle bodies, it's a very tractable, very usable amount of power. I got all of my chassis stiffening. We'll go in that in some detail. I got the carbon fiber hood, hatch and bumpers, and the Lexan rear window to really lighten the car. And then was able to get really high quality epoxy priming onto the bare metal and then build it all the way up. And we'll get into that to like a Concours quality, wet sanded glossy clear coat. So really awesome paint. But the thing that everyone jumps up and down about when they see the car for the first time is the original OEM interior. And by the way, OEM stands for original equipment manufacturer. So it's the new old stock fabric, and that's what NOS stands for. And using firmer foam core, and then it's like 2 steps. So there's a firm foam, and then there's a lighter 3/4 inch layer that gives you a bit of give. So the seats are very supportive and comfortable, but they really do hold you in place. So I'm super happy about that. People love the look of the interior of the car. So the engine's bored and stroked out as far as you can go. It's running as much compression as you can handle on a street car, 11.5 to 1. Big valves, ported and polished, but keeping the volume of the port sizes down and keeping the velocity of the airflow up. And so the car does produce mid-range torque as well as high-end horsepower. Lots of custom little bits, dual fuel rails for idle and low speed performance and economy, and then high performance with the further out higher volume fuel injectors. Stainless steel used everywhere in the car, and with AND fittings. The stands for Army Navy. That's those are fittings that are used mainly in race cars, and I've done a bunch of racing, so I'm very familiar and comfortable with AND fittings. In the exhaust system, again, trying not to go crazy. 2.25 inch stainless steel exhaust end to end keeps the velocity up on the exhaust gases, and it keeps the torque in the mid-range up without hurting high-end power. So big 1 3/4 inch racing primaries necking down to a more moderate sized exhaust, and it sounds great. It flows incredibly well. It works. And then we've got like the classic original 020 5-speed close ratio transmission in there. It's been built up with ARP bolts and the Quaife limited slip differential and the bigger Mark II 100 millimeter axle flanges and so on. We'll talk about the transmission more in a sec. Basically, these things are marginal for 200 plus horsepower applications, but they are lightweight, and I really wanted to keep the weight down. So as long as you don't abuse this transmission, it'll generally last quite a while. And then I've got a couple different clutch systems. I ran the Stage 3 system for a while, and then upgraded more recently to the Stage 5, and I don't really think I need the Stage 5. It's a multi-puck clutch disc that's quite grabby and a little bit tricky to use, but it's just got incredible clamping power for a single clutch system. But I think the Stage 3 is fine for street use, and I think in the future switching back to the Stage 3 by the new owner might be a smart move. Really high-end, beautiful, high-rated racing axles for the car. Custom radiator, electric water pump, digital controller, Full custom oiling system. We'll get into that with the external filter and oil intercoolers. Super expensive lithium iron phosphate battery system. It's EarthX. They do batteries for airplanes, so it's got all kinds of safety features and double computer battery management circuits and all kinds of cool things. And I've also got computer controlled alternator charging. Holley makes the computer and the touchscreen dash, and it's just a tour de force with 150 inputs and outputs and an awesome Holley racing ignition system. Tech 53 built the calipers. They're spec'd by Tech 53, and then Willett actually makes them under contract. Lots of other goodies in the braking system. Makes it really a lot of fun, and it's computer adjustable, so you can adjust the amount of vacuum in the servo, so it changes how much brake pressure you need. So you want to be a boy racer, you'd probably use a little bit less vacuum and have a little bit more stiffness in the pedal. The KWs are amazing. They really allow you to go firm, but be able to have your cake and eat it too, and adjust it down so it's softer when you want it to be softer, and it's firm when you want it to be firm. And I've got multiple spring sets for street and track use. There's a hollow Autotech rear sway bar. The front doesn't need the sway bar. The rear does. And then I've got urethane and Delring bushings being used around the whole suspension and steering system. Very, very nice special shifter linkage. And the leather wrap steering wheel and custom steering U-joints and bushings and all kinds of little goodies around the steering system. Close ratio gearing in the steering, rack and pinion. So unbelievable precision and feel. Sunroof is completely new, and so beautiful mechanism, gorgeous stuff. Everything in those old cars has been rotted out years ago, and I managed to find all new original pieces and build a brand new sunroof out of it, and it's awesome. It's still whining by hand, very funky. There's electric windows and electric seat heaters and an electric air conditioning system, and then a fantastic audio system. And at night you're running with LED headlights and LED bulbs used throughout the car, in fact. And so it's awesome. There's lots of videos and there's lots of photos online. So you can see from these pictures I'm going to show you here, the car is really clean. It runs the Euro bumpers. I always found the US spec bumpers looked really heavy and kind of incorrect for the car. I've got the front wheels spaced out 3 millimeters. The rears are spaced out. The fronts are spaced out 5 on each side, and the rears are spaced out 18 on each side. And there's axle spacers in the rear, plus a 3 millimeter spacer. So it fills in the gap at the back and squares the back off and makes the car look more muscular. Makes it look just better, I think. So yeah, no, it's just a nice clean look. You can spot the racing radiator through the grille, but that's the only thing that gives the car away, really. And you can see in the back here, the stainless exhaust, very subtle. It's a 2.5-inch exhaust tip, so it's a bit of a muscular look to it, but not overwhelming. And with the rear wheels being, the axles being spaced out, then the end's got a nice square look. The original stock look was a little bit skinny and spindly looking. Yeah, so it's sort of a badass look to the back of the car. And I've spaced the shifter knob back 2 inches just so I didn't have to reach forward quite as far. I just felt that the original position of the shifter wasn't ideal, so I mean that's easily reversible if someone wants to put it back the way it's meant to be. But as I said, the interior, once you close that panel that's got the additional controls on it, you would never know. And because I've added air conditioning, I've put the air conditioning vents into the center of the console, which is very nice to have. But yeah, the interior is just ridiculously nice. And it has a touchscreen digital dash, so this is one of many screens. You can program anything you want, and analog or digital. And I've tried to make this screen, the stock screen, to sort of make it look semi original. And then when you lift up the hood, it's the money shot. It lets people know it's not a stock car. You start to see some of the bracing, and you certainly see the intake system and the carbon fiber weave on the hood, and beautiful air box that shows off the trumpets, the intake trumpets. So pretty cool. So let's get into the details in the engine. So as I said, it's very tractable, and one of the things I worked very hard on was keeping parasitic drag to an absolute minimum. So that means no power steering pump, no big heavy alternator. The racing alternator is small and it gets disconnected at wide open throttle. And it's an electric water pump, so there's no mechanical pumping losses. And so the car, any power the engine produces goes to the crank, basically. And it's light and it works fantastically. So it's a tall deck Mark III ABA block, and lots of special bits in here. So ARP, rod bolts, head studs, crank sprocket, dowel pins, all kinds of interesting high performance things holding this engine together. Once we put the pistons and the rods and the crank together, everything was dynamically balanced. And then the heads are crazy awesome. They're beautifully put together heads, and with the largest possible valves you could stuff into them. The cams, yes, it's a heavy duty solid lifter cam, but it works. It doesn't kill the low end on this engine, and it produces significant power gains above 6,500 RPM. So I was unsure about it when it was recommended to me by Josh, the engine builder, but now that I've got it, it's like, yeah, it's really defines the engine. And yeah, you could put in a smaller cam if you wanted to. That's, future owners can do what they want. Leak down test is sort of the gold standard for how well an engine is sealing. You pressurize each cylinder and you see how much air leaks out. Test the rings and the valve seats and the head gaskets and everything. If you get under 7 or 8%, an engine is considered to be as new. If you get under 5%, it's really, really good. And we're at 4% or better on all cylinders. So this thing is sealing, and it is broken in beautifully. So it's not going to burn any oil. There's a lot of expensive parts on this engine, and because it's computer controlled, literally the idle speed is, it's programmed through the different temperature when it's cold versus warm, and it's got all kinds of neat little features here. But at the end of the day, it's beautiful to look at, and it's reliable, and it just plain works. So the 95.5 millimeter crank is a diesel crank. We didn't knife edge it because the mass of the crank, even though it keeps the engine from, revving really quickly when you're not in gear, having the extra mass smooths out the idle and makes the car more tractable. And so it's recommended, I think, for a street car not to have a knife edge crank. And you don't need to rev the piss out of this engine. As I said, it's producing its maximum power. Once you're up above 7,000 RPM, you're there. Yes, you can take it up past 8 for the street. I set the rev limiter at 7,500. No need to over rev it. But yeah, it's clean. And those pistons, you can reduce the compression by swapping a Mark III head gasket in. I'm running a Mark IV head gasket. You'll get down to 11-1 with the slightly thicker Mark III gasket. So they're SuperTech valves that are supplied by Tectonics, and they're very thin intake valve stems, sort of Honda style. The stocks are 7, and these ones are 5.5, and the exhaust valves are much larger, and you can't narrow them down, so they're just undercut a little bit to 6.5 millimeters. But as I said, we very careful with the porting and polishing without reducing the velocity, keeping the velocity up. And beautiful alternator, CNC aluminum and serpentine belt system mount that by EAA Engineering. And then a Kent Cams adjustable cam sprocket that's quite reliable. And you can see the curved intake throttle bodies, independent throttle bodies. And yeah, just a really beautiful engine. Here's some more pictures of it. We've got the Motorsport windage tray. Obviously, tons of stainless braided hoses for fuel and cooling. You got the fluid damper and some air horns, which I love the sound of. And then we'll get into the actual measured results. So we actually did a wheel dyno, and 15 to 20% drivetrain loss means the car is it'll producing somewhere north of 240 horsepower and almost 195 foot-pounds at the crank, at the wheel. At the crank when you subtract those losses out. And we ran through several dyno polls, and we were slowly playing around with the timing and the target air fuel ratios and what the right length of runners in the trumpet sizes and different things. And that's how we ended up bumping up an additional 10 horsepower and improving torque, is just tuning it as we were going. And then there's some fun you can have by just looking at actual performance on the road. So take the acceleration from the G's are measured by the computer. The weight of the vehicle, what gear you're in. You can calculate how much torque is at the wheel, and then you can back calculate to the engine. And so that's what that one graph in the upper left-hand corner is. So again, matches really well with what we measured on the dyno. And then the other one on the lower right-hand corner is just looking at fuel flow that the computer is self-tuned to. And this is comparing catalyst and non-catalyst performance. And you can see that the torque curve with the catalyst-equipped car is actually better. Overall, it's got way more torque below 3,000 RPM with the catalyst included. So it's a better street car, better for idling around town in. And then you can see if we uncork it, how much additional power it produces. So you got three different ways of looking at the amount of power this thing's producing, and they all line up nicely with each other. Engine's only as good as the oiling system. You got to keep the oil cool and filtered. So we're using the 16-valve oil pump, the original OEM oil pump, and the VW Motorsport windage tray. We're running Joe Gibbs oil, full synthetic. You start off with non-synthetic break-in oil, and then you switch it out to the full synthetic after you've got at least a couple thousand miles in the engine. So I went through several oil changes during the break-in period and early period, and then we're now running the full synthetic now that the engine's properly broken in. You've got a remote-mounted oil cooler and then a thermostat-controlled oil flow through to the oil cooler. So there's a bunch of stuff going on here. You can see from the next page here. The coolant to oil intercooler works incredibly well. That Laminova. And you don't have to reach up and try to get access to the stock oil filter. You can literally reach under the car and pull this, these are AND fittings again, and pull the Canon air oil filter off, pull the element out, inspect it, see if there's any shit in there, any issues, and you can just wash it out with solvent and then dry it and put it back together again. So it's a really, really nice system. Cooling system, as I've said earlier, that it runs a custom radiator. It's got two different Spall puller fans. One is being driven by a 7-volt power supply, so it spins the fan slowly at 170 degrees Fahrenheit. And then if it goes above 180, it'll kick the high-speed fan in. The system is proven to work very well. And the controller pulses the water pump when the engine's cold, and then it starts flowing faster and faster as the engine gets hotter. So it's all adjustable. You can change whatever engine temperature you want on the fly with the controller. And here's some pictures of it all. So system works super well. And that electric water pump, the Davies Craig company in Australia that makes it, does the same systems for Mercedes and Porsche and BMW. So they're building high quality stuff, and so everything here is like first tier quality and keeps the engine in the right operating temperature range. So really nice system. I mentioned the exhaust system. It's a badass exhaust. I really put a lot of time and effort designing this thing and getting it right. And I like the sound of it, and I like the way it works. So lots of good stuff going on here. You can see in the pictures the stainless exhaust. We've got a bracket that supports the bottom of the header and triangulates it to the bottom of the block just above the oil pan. Keeps it from fatiguing and breaking off, because this is what happens with racing exhaust systems. And there's a flex pipe in the system, which is necessary and important. And there's both catalyst and non-catalyst versions of the exhaust. So works super, super well. So the transmission, again, it's a stock 020 basically. I've swapped the final drive. I shouldn't say the final drive. It's a 16 valve Mark II final drive, so it's a little longer ratio than the Mark I. And then again, I've moved to a long 0.76 fifth gear. Leaves a bit of a gap between fourth and fifth, but it certainly brings the revs down. So if you're doing highway use driving, it's lower RPM. So you're buzzing along at 75 miles an hour at 2,800 RPM. It's a lot easier on you. Kind of be nice to have maybe an O2M or J transmission with the 6-speed, but you got the extra weight there, so that's something to think about. Anyway, with this car, this transmission, if you're not power shifting and you're not just abusing this thing, I think the 020 is going to last quite a while. I've got a little bit of an issue with the car. It's brand new transmission, just rebuilt by German Auto Transaxle in Bend, Oregon. Since they put it back together with new internals, second gear, if you don't match the revs going into second gear, you can get a bit of grinding. And I've talked to Ken, who built the transmission. He said, listen, the new owner's going to probably decide, what do they want for final drive? What do they want for fifth gear? What do they want for the clutch? And, the transmission is going to get pulled out because you're going to have to make those changes. So when you decide what you want, send me the transmission. I'll put the gear sets in that you want, and we'll have a look at the second gear synchro, because it looks like it's acting up a bit. And he'll get that all straightened away for the new owner. And I want to make sure people have a perfect car when they get it. That's the only thing that's really stands out as not perfect, and I want to make it right for people. So what can I say? So it's got all the goodies in it. California clutch makes good pressure, clutch discs and pressure plates, and you can decide to leave the stage 5 in there, or if you want to go back to the stage 3, that's your business. And just a couple of things here. So USRT does the shifter system, so it's using the Hem joint, ball joint, shifter linkage ends that are all individually adjustable for length, so you can finely tune how well the shifting works. And there's Teflon bushings in the system. There's all kinds of goodies, so it shifts very precisely, very cleanly, and pretty awesome. And there's ARP fasteners as well. Suspension. So I was running originally Bilstein's Rally front struts and race rear shocks, and they're just too stiff. They're fine on the track when I had stiffer 440-pound front and 350-pound rear springs in, but when you start putting street level spring rates in, those shocks were overpowering. Now I could have sent them back and had them revalved by Bilstein, but I decided, heck with it, gonna go completely high end and buy these KW German variant 3 coilovers that are, click, click, click. You can adjust the bound and rebound and compression. And when they're one stop off full soft, which is the minimum you're supposed to run, the car's really butter smooth with the 250 front and 200 pound per inch rear springs. As soon as you go to the second click, it starts to firm up. And if you go 3 or 4 clicks in, it's quite firm. So it's remarkable how well it works. So you can have your cake and eat it too. And I wouldn't recommend putting the KW 342, 285 springs back in unless you're going to do some track days. I just think it's too much for the street. And you get comments from other people with Mark 1 saying, yeah. And I think one of the problems with this particular car, the Ultimate 83 GTI, is quite light. And the lighter the car, the more it's going to feel stiff with a given spring rate, obviously. So that's something to think about. What's right, and people often put in really stiff springs and then they regret it because it just wears you out and tires you out and it bashes the car to pieces too, right? So very individual. New owner can figure that out. But it's a beautifully done suspension system. So we didn't go overboard. We're running sort of modified upper rubber strut mounts. The strut bearings are the Febby Bilstein upper mounts, and they're injected with additional urethane to stiffen them up a bit more, but they still have some give. And we tried everywhere in the system to leave some play and some give, just so that the car doesn't transmit vibration and act too much like a race car. So yeah, and it's set up with just enough negative camber that the car is responsive and it's not overdone for the street use right now. So beautiful looking stuff. And yeah, you just boom. You can just grab your coilover wrench and adjust the height in 5 minutes or less. And certainly the same thing with the stiffness. And the snowflake wheels are beautiful. They've been all redone inside and out, and you can eat off them. They're gorgeous. So the steering, big deal. The original Mark 1s, they do not last. The steering column gets loose and the bearings get wonky, and the U-joints in the steering column wear out, and there's no replacements available, and it's just a shit show. So you end up with an old car. You may repaint it and put new suspension and engine and transmission, but you got this shitty steering wheel and shitty feel to steering. It's a loose feel. And there's videos on the internet of people reviewing the old Mark 1s going, everything's great in these cars except for the steering, and it's because the steering's worn out. So I'll just switch to the picture right away here. So yeah, first thing I did is investigated how to rebuild the U-joints, and found a way to take a couple of Mercedes-Benz late model U-joint shafts and build a custom connector for them for adjustable length. And then just as you can see the picture, the black one is the original VW, and then the lower one is the Mercedes, and they're just it's like zero play, super precise, really solid. And then above that you see the GTI steering wheel. It's been rewrapped in leather from this Dallas, Texas company that uses Italian leather. And there's grind down the wheel a little bit, put some foam, and then put the leather around it. You get just a little bit of give. It's a much more modern feeling steering wheel. Beautiful to hold. I've got the Tech 53 steering column bearings and bushings and stuff. The Quaife limited, the quick ratio steering rack, and then the axles that are bulletproof and really tight, and the whole thing's really precise. So feels fantastic, looks great. Brakes. The one thing that the original car just didn't do well. I worked hard on this so that on the racetrack, you're going 120 miles an hour into a tight corner and you just stand on the binders and the thing stops. It's beautiful. How did we achieve it? We achieved it by not going for huge rotors, but by staying with the 10-inch rotors and using a lot of torque on those rotors. So a lot of force. When I was racing and I used the DTC 60 race pads, you were replacing the rotors after a day at the track because it would just eat the rotors alive. Just so much torque being applied and so much heat being applied, just eat the rotors up. So basically on the street, that's not going to be the issue. But, really what's in there right now is you've got 10-inch front discs, you've got the Mark II rear discs, and then the Mark IV rear calipers. But the big story here is the Willett Tech 53 front big piston calipers, 4-piston calipers. They're just enormous. I built a table here. Oh, by the way, to make that all work, you need a proportioning valve, like the Willett valve I'm using. You need to go to a bigger master cylinder, and I highly recommend Castrol SRF racing fluid. High temperature boiling point, but it lasts forever. It's not very hydroscopic, so you don't have to replace it very often. And although I recommend that the new owner, once they get the car and they've driven it for a bit, they should replace the brake fluid, because I didn't replace it in the last 12 months. So get that replaced next year. And yeah, so here's a table, and this table is, me geeking out, mapping out all the different braking combinations that are available for the Mark I, basically, and calculating based on piston area, total piston area, the front rear brake bias, which is always wrong on these cars. And this is why I'm so proud that we managed to get the right brake bias and the right pressures on front and rear, so that this thing was super reliable and super successful. So go ahead and geek out. You can see this table online, and you can edit it yourself from my website. So some pictures you can see, comparing on the upper left-hand corner, the original, they're called Dynalite calipers that are made by Willett, and then the Tech 53 variants on the right side that have got massive pistons by comparison. So going from a 1 1/4 inch piston to a 1 5/8 inch piston, big difference in area. And other than that, just the pedals are adjustable. So this picture on the lower right hand corner doesn't show it, but I have an aluminum racing pedal that bolts on top of the original pedal, and you can adjust the height of the pedals individually with the system here, and then you've basically got the ability to just rest your foot on the brake and the gas at the same time, and you can heel and toe beautifully. And the Lila Autosports does the rear brake. The whole axle is extended out with extra long hardware to do the 50mm offset in the rear. So that's a really nice system as well. Air conditioning. I'm a geek. I did not want the extra 75 pounds that an air conditioning system puts on the front end of the car. So I figured sort of a mini AC system, a 12-volt electric AC compressor. It doesn't throw a lot of BTUs, but 3,000 is enough to knock the incoming air temperature down by almost 20 degrees on a hot day. And that makes all the difference in the world. So looking at the pictures again, I've mounted the evaporator under the car. There's 6 waterproof fans up underneath it that blow air across it. The electric air AC compressor is sitting in the engine compartment, and so the condenser's in the car, and the evaporator is sitting on top of the in the rain tray area. And you can see ice form on the expansion valve and on the intake line to the evaporator. And so it gets cold, it works. And there's a little picture of a test here where the incoming air temperature into the car was 19 degrees Celsius, and the outside air temperature was almost 32. So it works. And unlike a standard automotive system, you don't need as much, like when you charge the system and you put the R134A refrigerant into the system, you're looking on a hot day to get 22.5 pounds of pressure on the low side, and the high side would only be about 130 psi. So it's a lot less than what you would see on a larger mechanical compressor driven automotive system. But hey, I like it. It works. Interior. Okay, so tons of work. An infinite amount of work went into doing this, and I'll step through the process, but basically it involves building a stronger, a lot of the plastics in these old cars, ultraviolet light hits them, and damages and sort of causes the sort of plastic to rot. And so you'll find that in these old cars, the interiors are shot. It's not just the fabric in the seats, but the plastic's brittle and it's cracked or it's even dissolved away. And so you need to rebuild the surfaces of the plastic up using plastic fillers and plastic texturing compounds. Then you have to sand them carefully. And then you build up really strong plastic paint on top of the surfaces. And you basically rehabilitate all the pieces. And so there's a lot going on there. And of course, it's all new wiring in the car, and it's all new lights and a lot of new switches and things. But the plastic, the materials that are used extensively inside of the car all have been redone. So back to the picture. So there's a picture of the sunroof mechanism, by the way. So it's all new. It's all like gorgeous. It's not rusted out and broken or parts missing. It all works and it's all new and great. And then the lower left-hand corner, you can see me in the basement of the house. It's a standard thing. Got all the different parts, and you're working to color code and paint and repair and patch and fill, and then slowly put it all back together. And then these on the lower right-hand corner, these are the Mark II window mechanisms, which I adapted for the Mark I. And part of it was I could not get the high-performance Hertz mid-woofers into the door without interfering with the winding mechanism. And it's actually nice having the electric windows, even though it's not period correct. So these are pictures of the headliner going in. Lots of work to do that, but looks great having a new headliner. And then just assembling the interior piece by piece, just a ton of work. So yeah, the steering column completely, new, all the new switchgear, all the new turn signals and everything else, and just so many things that hidden in the dash that are all new. And then the result is just like thrilling to sit in the car and have it look like 1982, 83, 84. It's wonderful. So getting to the point where the body and the paint are back is so much work. So I'm just going to step you through what a bare metal, like the process for building a bare metal system is. And people often don't want to go to the effort of going all the way to the metal, but you discover any problems and then you have every opportunity to make it right. And stiffening is a big part of it. So, adding fiberglass or carbon fiber, that's tricky too, because those panels are never dimensionally as straight and as smooth, and getting the gaps between the panels correct. I found that buying the super expensive carbon fiber panels from the UK and shipping them over, they just didn't fit. And I spent hundreds of hours making those panels flat and square and having the gaps correct. And it's like, but now that it's done, it's amazing. And you work, once you've got, the epoxy on, you then go through this endless step from epoxy to the high build primer and the sealer to the base coat to the clear coat and all the sanding and all the layers in between. It's at thousands of hours, but you get it to a point where you realize that it's not cost effective to do this with factory cars. So anyway, on to the pictures. So really wanted to smooth the engine bay. So just a ton of work involved. I welded it up and then I smoothed it and added some stiffening. As you can see, there's tubes that run from the strut towers to the horns in the front of the car, and then there's an aftermarket brace that attaches to the fender bolts, and then it supports the front engine mount and then goes back up. So you get a nice sort of structural stiffness to the engine, and the engine bay looks really nice when it's been smoothed, obviously. Under the car, lower right-hand corner, you can see I'd cut out some panels that were sort of, they're sort of rotted, and I thought, screw it. So I cut them out and put the Clocker Home panels in, and then welded in, running down both sides of the car, a subframe end to end on the car. And then in the middle, you can see I've got additional new OEM braces. They're Clocker Home again, but OEM style braces. So there's a ton of stiffening that went in there, and I built lift points for lifting the car up. There's actually steel lift points that are reinforced, so there's no more damage in the car when people lift their cars up. On the inside, this is where I did a bunch of additional hidden stiffening. So I put in a 14 gauge panel running, just where the rear seat is, across there to stiffen that area up. And then running along above the frame rails, I put an 1/8 inch piece of steel, and I used a plasma cutter to cut out all those circular holes. But I welded in a whole bunch of 1/8 inch steel vertically running across the sill plates. And then the seat mounts themselves have been stiffened as well laterally across the engine. So, and then when you paint it, you don't even know anything's happened. It all looks like it's all stock. So even though you can't see this because it's all hidden by plastic and carpet, I was very keen on smoothing this out and making it all look gorgeous so that if someone ever took the carpet out, they'd go, wow, what a nice job. So yeah, I was fussy about everything. So yeah, in the upper right-hand corner, you can see there's the new frame rail and how I've blended it into the door sills, the lower door sills. Like just a ton of work to get that dialed. And then my car, and it's just the way some of these cars were from the factory, the sail panel around the gas cap was sort of like, it didn't have a nice curve to it. Like there should be like a butter smooth sort of arching curve to the back end of these cars. And it was sort of flat on my car, almost as if it had been hit, but it hadn't. It was just the way the body panels came out of the mold. So I reshaped them a little bit and got those panels looking the way they should with the correct curvature. And then where you often get rust in these cars, just behind the wheel well at the back, I cleaned all that stuff up and made it all perfect. And the factory had undercoating sprayed down in these lower layers, and I've got all that off, and it's all been finished like all the paint everywhere else. So the paint on these lower areas of the car is just as beautiful as the paint on the hood. This is an example of what it looks like when you've sprayed high build primer and then you start blocking it out. So it's still a sacrificial coat, but it's there to get rid of any minor imperfections. And you can see the work I did on the ass end of the car, something that most people wouldn't waste any time on. I put a ton of time on making it absolutely perfect. And you can see the LWS panels that have arrived from Europe. And then here in the middle, I've taken the hood and I've actually installed a piece of aluminum angle bracket that run across the hood to stiffen it, because it was just like a noodle. It was like a wet noodle. It was really not at all stiff enough. So added about a pound to do that. But together, all these panels, probably saved 80, 90 pounds by switching out the steel parts and putting in all this carbon fiber. And then you can see me working. This is just one example on the right-hand side of the rear hatch of how I had to redo all the gaps for these carbon fiber panels. And boy, does it ever turn out. So there's that hood. I've got the underside exposed so you can see it's made out of carbon fiber, and then the top it's all dialed. And that's just an example of the door. Hasn't yet got the clear on it in this picture. It's just had the base coat. Underside of the car and the fenders and other things, it's starting to be final coated. And then again, for the fender flares, I've used the Plasti Dip. So underneath the Plasti Dip is a flexible plastic filler to get rid of any, usually there's little chips that are out of it. And then you can always remove the Plasti Dip, but I usually just take them off once a year, use a little bit of plastic filler to clean up any little nicks or scratches or holes from debris that came off the tires that have hit it, and then respray it, and they look really great. Front grille, redid the accent stripe, and then the bumpers. The way the bumpers work, the upper right hand corner, you can see it's a 1x2 inch channel aluminum, and then that has been then wrapped in carbon fiber and then foam injected between the carbon fiber and the aluminum. So the bumpers are quite strong. I just don't recommend people actually push on them just in case they break them, but people have pushed on them when I've forgotten to tell them not to, and nothing seems to happen. They're quite rigid, but I prefer that people just keep their fingers off the carbon fiber. But yeah, that whole system of building those bumpers up worked super well, and instead of a 25-pound bumper, it's a 5-pound bumper. Fuel system, last but not least, might as well, just say you don't need to go overboard. I've got a 155 liter per hour Walbro pump, and all this stuff is supplied by Kinsler fuel injection. So just flip over to the pictures. You can see the pump is wrapped in foam. There's a pre-filter and there's a post-filter, and and then there's number 6 lines running along the inside of the frame rails to the front of the car and up to the front of the engine. So it all works well. Now the electronics, I can't get into this in too much detail because there's just so much here, but I do have all the software. You can install the Holley engine management software and then download my file and see all of my programming and play with the software. You don't have to buy anything. So yeah, there's a ton of computer inputs and computer outputs, as you can see here, monitoring and controlling so many things. So here's a bunch of the outputs. So just lots and lots going on with the computer. So yeah, I've got a manual online with all the computer screens. You can flip through and see all my programming. I guess one of the exciting things for me is that I'm an engineer, so I love data logging. So you've got 30 samples a second times 150 input-output points, so you can build incredibly detailed data logging results. And it's got a 2-axis accelerometer, so you can measure your vehicle performance on the street or the track, and you can go crazy. Hey, what powers all this is this super expensive lithium battery that doesn't weigh anything. Sits in the trunk wheel well and provides a higher sort of average, it's sort of like a 13.5 versus 12.5 volt sort of average voltage to the system. And then I have this computer charging alternator system to keep it from overcharging, because you don't really want to overcharge lithium batteries. It just reduces their life expectancy. So I got all that figured out where it'll let it charge quickly up to 14 volts, and then it'll keep it from going over 14 volts. And I also have a charger. So if the car's been sitting for a long period, you can just plug a charger into the trunk, and I've written some software to control the charger so that it again won't overcharge the battery, because these chargers typically will pull the battery voltage up to 14.5 volts and just leave it there, and that's not what you want. The Dominator sits in the rain tray. You can see how I've wired it in there. The electric air conditioning evaporator sits on top of it. And and there's still a few inputs and outputs that are available if you want to wire additional goodies into the system. That's a duplicate screen, so just ignore that. I've got a couple of pictures coming up here of the wiring before it was absolutely completed, but there is a trunk line that runs from the front of the car to the back of the car through the frame rails effectively on the side of the car. And I've got a list here of all of the circuits that run from front to back. So I'm just going to flick to the picture here. You can see there's a Lexan panel that swings down. It's on a hinge underneath the glove box. And this is not fully wired yet, obviously, but it's showing you how the system's going together. And then I've got all of the fuses and all of the major relays labeled. There was one more relay panel that was added after the car was partly assembled, because I just needed more relays for things like controlling the brake servo boost. I needed to switch resistors in and out of the circuit, And same thing with the electric air conditioning system, which is a multi-speed electric compressor. I needed to switch resistors in and out, so I had a bunch of small, low current relays that are mounted on a separate panel above this panel that switch the resistors in and out. And this is a picture of the LED Philips lighting. So absolutely beautiful lighting pattern, very bright, crisp lights. What else? So the audio system, last major thing I'm going to talk about. So really trick system. The kicker IQ amp. So there's 30 band EQ for every channel, active crossovers, and time delays for each channel. Used audiophile quality Hertz speakers for the mids and the highs at the front, and then a super expensive 10-inch carbon fiber Rockford Fosgate subwoofer built into the back. So if you can imagine, that subwoofer is like $600 just for the raw driver, but it's a really nice sound to it. Car is a little bit loud to hear the quality of the, like, you'd want the car to be dead quiet if you want to hear everything perfectly. So when the engine's not on and you listen to the audio system, it's stunning. And when you're driving, you can turn it up super loud because it's very powerful, but usually you just want to listen to the engine. But yeah, you can also crank up AC/DC or whatever you want to hear. So yeah, you can buy apps, and not buy apps, you can just download apps onto your phone or your PC, and then take my configuration files and you can load them up and you can play with them and see what I've done with the system to have it all professionally, because I'm an audio engineer, so this is one of the things I like. And back in the day, the killer audio system was the Concorde head-end unit, the HPL 130 with DBX noise reduction. There was Nakamichi and there was Concorde. There's a few Alpine. Concorde was probably the top of the food chain. And I had one in my original car. I was very proud of it. And so I stuck a brand new old stock unit. That was $1,000 for me to acquire that. It's pure eye candy. I don't use it for anything because I stream Bluetooth from the phone straight to the amp, the kicker amp. But it's just nice looking at it every day going, that's a period piece that's in the dash. It's period correct. And it was the finest that you could get back in the day. So there's a couple more pictures of the audio system. And yeah, it's pretty awesome the way it works. So that's in the wheel well in the back, the bits and pieces. And yeah, there's a few more pictures. And there's some pictures of the software and the Hertz speakers. I'm not using the passive crossover for the Hertz tweeters and mid-ranges because we're driving everything from active crossovers in the amplifier. And here's just a simple example of some of the software for the Holley ECU. So there's dozens of screens of this software, and they're in the manual that I have online. But you can sort of see it's a lot of programming graphically, but it's also self-tuning. So once you set the target air-fuel ratios, it self-programs and learns. So pretty neat system. So there's a little under $5,000 worth of spare parts coming with the car. So all the Bentley manuals and spare parts for the engine and a spare cooling system water pump and a spare fuel pump. Oh, there's a typo there. It says fuel ump. And a bunch of these high dollar Kinsler paper and metal mesh filters. And the oiling system, I've got these things called crush washers, which are used in the aircraft industry to make sure that nothing leaks, because AN fittings can sometimes leak. So I've got them for the fuel system and the AN system, and they're spare washers. You can reuse them, but I've got extras. As a transmission, I've got things like, installation tools for the clutch system and for pulling the axles in and out, gaskets, alignment tools, all kinds of cool things, even a spare shifter lever. So yeah, you're all set to go to maintain and support this car. And brakes, really nice, expensive UK made slotted rotors for the fronts, and an extra set of hot Hawk street pads, and lots of miscellaneous bits and pieces for the rear axles and rear brakes to be serviced. I've got some spare wheel locks and nuts and beautiful low profile jack stands. And the reason why I provide them with the car is you use like a car lift, a jack lift, and you lift up on one corner in the front of the car, and then you slip these jack stands in on front and rear, and then you can service both the front and rear wheels and tires at the same time. Because the car is super stiff, you just grab it, lift one corner, and the whole thing lifts up. And then boom, you got half the car lifted in the air. It's actually really nice. And I got some exhaust bits, obviously a spare set of springs for the KWs. And if you need to pull the transmission out, it's probably easiest to pull out the air conditioning compressor. So you'd want to refill and put new refrigerant back in the system and recharge it. So I've got spare refrigerant available. And then all kinds of plastic and metal paint, just to, anything to do with keeping the paint looking good, or any touch-ups inside or outside of the car. I've got all that spare stuff. And and a million little clips and screws and pins and things that I've collected along the way that may come in useful for anybody that wants to take apart the interior and put it back together for any reason, especially the seats. And then on the computer side of it, I've got obviously the battery charger and the software disconnect module, and I've got spare light bulbs and alternator belts in case you want to put a larger alternator in, because the only thing that I don't like is that the 50 amp alternator doesn't really give you a lot of excess current for things like running electric air conditioning. So you'll be really careful about what's powered up and what's not powered up when you're running the AC. And if you just swap in a larger alternator and said, I don't care if I have a bigger or heavier alternator, then you're going to have more headroom with your electric budget. And that's basically it. So I'm going to have, just after this now, the walk around of the car. And we'll show you the state of the finish of the car. Okay, this is a visual inspection quality walk around. So the carbon fiber hood, very beautiful underneath. It's quite a nice feature. The engine basement's smooth for the most part. It's pretty much flawless. There's lots and lots of beautiful details, things going on inside here, and it's nice and shiny, and lots of eye candy, as they say. The money shot. The grill's clean, and the bumper has been repainted because I redid the paint on the whole, most of the car actually. So the spoilers all clean, and I redid the fender flares. They're just done in satin black plasti dip. Wheels are gorgeous, obviously. So this side of the car and the hood. So the hood's been redone because there was a little chip in the front of it. And so the hood's all clean and it's all wet sound. It's got new glass in it because the glass had a little bit of pitting from use. The roof is clean, very clean. So this whole side of the car has been re-sprayed and re-wet sanded. Mainly because there was a little, just above the door handle, I'd whacked it when I reinstalled the factory seats. I actually put a little nick in the paint. It's really pissing me off. The only thing about these cars is the front wheels throw debris. So underneath the sill, where I've done this welded in sort of hidden subframe, there's some little bits of rock pitting on both sides of the car, And I touch it up if anything nicks through the clear, but then it tends to scar the rear fender flare. But that's been refinished by me now, so yeah. So the glass is back, yeah, and all that. So let's zoom in a little bit. Yeah, it's just a bit of dust. So this is clear, clean. The wheel down the side of the car, the door. As I said, like, you won't find anything wrong at all on the side of the car because it's just been redone, and it's got 0 miles on it. Yeah. Okay. Rear wheel. And I still got a little bit of wax or polish on it. Hasn't seen the sunlight yet. Sail panel's beautiful. The rear quarters clean, beautiful. The rear hatch, like the front, is made out of fiberglass, not fiberglass, carbon fiber, and then that's a Lexan window. Not perfect because these edges, the 4 corners, I had to put the Lexan into the carbon fiber. It's the carbon fiber is so soft, you actually have to sort of drop and glue in the Lexan and then put the moldings around manually. So there's these little corner pieces in each corner that had to be used. So it's not super obvious, but it's less than perfect. But anytime you use these carbon fiber panels, they're a little wonky. It took me a long time to get these things straight. So the exhaust, I used a 2.5-inch pipe at the back, and it's a 2.25-inch exhaust though. But the whole thing's super clean in the back. There's nothing amiss on the back of the car either. And the sail panel's perfect. Going on to the bottom here as well. Another wheel. And yeah, so there's nothing to speak of here that's amiss. Again, some small pitting of rocks underneath the sill panel. This door and the front fender are all good, except there's one, you can't see it, but there's a little chip that got cleaned up right there. Just a rock chip. So who knows how exactly that happened, but sometimes rocks bounce around on the highway. And this car's had a total of 6,000 miles of driving on it. So this side has seen 6,000 miles of use. And then again, so the fender's good. This side's clean again. And then the wheel here, again, pretty damn nice. Door jambs, they're all good. Nothing wonky in the door jambs. The interior of the car, we don't have the proper lighting. Let me just grab a flashlight here and see if does this throw any light. A little bit. Okay, let's do it underneath. So, yeah, I'll just use photos, but basically it's totally clean. It's brand new everywhere on the inside. It's shocking how nice the original seats came out using a firmer foam, so it's a bit more supportive than the original foam. It's still very comfortable, but it's just a 2 density layers. There's a deep, high density layer, and then there's a 1/2 inch of softer foam to give it a little bit of give, but it supports you really, really nicely. And I've got the actual carpet, the floor mats in the same matching material. I just don't use it for driving, but if you're going to show the car, that would definitely be the thing to do. The door cards are beautiful, and all new trim, all new molding, all new rubber. So yeah, and then the headrest.
which nobody ever sees. It's a huge amount of work to do it, but it's all brand new midnight blue headrest, and then the trunk is carpeted as well. So so that's the walk around. And will it look better in person or worse in person? I think it'll look about the same.